Just stay out of the frame, David said, adjusting his tie without looking at me. This is for Liz's Christmas cards. I stepped back from the fireplace where my family had arranged themselves like pieces in a store display. Liz smoothed Emma's hair while Mason checked his phone. The photographer, Sarah, waited with her camera raised. "Perfect," she said. "Everyone smile." They did. My son, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, a perfect family portrait for their perfect Christmas cards. I stood by the window, watching through the lens as they captured their happiness without me. The flash went off. Then another. Sarah took a dozen shots while I remained invisible, a shadow against the wall. "Got some beautiful ones," she announced, packing her equipment. "You'll love how they turned out." David walked her to the door. Liz gathered the children. No one looked at me as they discussed dinner plans, as if I'd already left. But I hadn't left. I was reaching for my phone, scrolling to a photo I'd kept for 55 years. A black and white image from 1968. Two men standing side by side, one young, one older, both in uniform, though only one of them was mine. "Where are you going, Grandpa Frank?" Emma asked as I moved toward the door. "Post office," I said. "Need to mail something." David barely glanced up. "It's Sunday. Post office is closed." "Express box is always open," I replied, patting my jacket pocket where I'd placed the old photograph. "Some things can't wait." I drove through streets decorated for the holidays, past houses where other families were probably taking their own perfect pictures. At the post office, I pulled out an envelope I'd addressed weeks ago when I first sensed this day would come. The White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. Inside the envelope, that photograph from 1968 and a letter I'd written but never sent. Until now. The boy I'd saved that day had grown up to become many things: a governor, a senator, and now the most powerful man in the world. I wondered if he still remembered the young sergeant who'd pulled him from that burning school. I dropped the envelope into the express slot and drove home, where my family was sitting down to dinner without setting a place for me. That was Sunday. By Wednesday, everything would change. Monday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The house felt different now. Not emptier, exactly, but charged with something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose, maybe. I pulled out the shoebox I kept in the hall closet. Family photographs spanning decades, from Emma's first steps to David's college graduation, Mason's baseball games, birthday parties, Thanksgivings. As I sorted through them, a pattern emerged that I'd been too blind to see before, or maybe too willing to ignore. David's wedding. I'm in the back row, partially hidden behind Liz's sister. Emma's 7th birthday. I'm cropped out of most shots, visible only as a hand passing cake. Last Christmas, I'm in exactly 3 photos out of 47. In 2 of them, I'm blurred from movement. It hadn't happened overnight. It was gradual, surgical. Each year, I occupied less space in their frame, until Sunday, when I finally occupied none at all. I picked up a photo from 5 years ago, David's promotion party. Liz had hired a professional photographer for that, too. In the center, David, Liz, the kids, her parents, her brother's family, arranged like royalty. And there I was, standing alone by the buffet table, holding a plate of food. looking like hired help who'd wandered into the shot. Liz's mother had made a comment that day, something about maintaining the aesthetic of their photos. I'd pretended not to hear it. David had pretended not to hear it, too. But I'd heard it, and I'd been hearing it ever since, in every arrangement, every pose, every time someone suggested I help with coats right before picture time. I stacked the photos and returned them to the box, all except one. David, at 8 years old, the day I'd taught him to ride a bike. His gap-toothed grin filled the frame. My hands were on his shoulders, keeping him steady, keeping him safe. That boy used to run to me when I came home from work, used to save me the last piece of pie, used to introduce me to his friends as my dad, the hero. Now he couldn't even save me a place in a photograph. I walked to my bedroom and opened the drawer of my nightstand. Inside, beneath old glasses and prescription bottles, was a manila folder I hadn't touched in decades. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the seal was still clear. United States Army, Commendation for Valor. And beneath that, newspaper clippings from 1968. Local sergeant saves 12 in school siege. Hero's quick thinking prevents tragedy. The children are alive today because of Sergeant Frank Miller's courage under fire. I'd never shown these to David, never hung them on the wall, never mentioned them at family dinners. My wife knew before she passed, but we'd agreed that the past should stay in the past. Maybe that had been a mistake. Maybe some things deserved to be remembered, even if, especially if, no one wanted to see them in the frame. Tuesday came and went. Wednesday arrived gray and cold. I was reading the morning paper when Mike knocked on my door, holding an official-looking envelope with my name typed across the front. "Certified mail, Frank," he said, handing me the clipboard. "Looks important." I signed for it and waited until he was gone before examining the return address. The White House, Office of the President. My hands were steadier than I'd expected as I opened it. Inside, a handwritten letter on presidential letterhead and a photograph I didn't recognize. Me shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit, both of us standing in what looked like the Oval Office. I had no memory of this photo being taken, but I recognized the man's face. Older now, grayer, but unmistakably the same 8-year-old boy I'd carried out of that burning school in Philadelphia 55 years ago. The letter began, "Dear Sergeant Miller," and ended, "I would be honored to meet with you again, to thank you properly for the gift of my life. My assistant will be in touch within the week to arrange your visit to Washington." It was signed in blue ink, "With eternal gratitude." I sat back in my chair and laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in months. The most powerful man in the world remembered me, but my own son couldn't find room for me in a Christmas card. Thursday morning brought snow to the streets, but inside my house, something warmer was building. I sat at the same kitchen table where I'd counted my exclusions from family photos, but now I held something different, a phone call I'd been expecting. "Mr. Miller, this is Jennifer Walsh from the President's office. I understand you'll be visiting us next week." "Yes, ma'am. The President wanted me to tell you personally how much this meeting means to him. He's cleared his entire afternoon schedule." I thanked her and hung up. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I called David. "Dad, everything okay?" His voice carried that tone children use when their elderly parents call unexpectedly. Half concern, half inconvenience. I wanted to let you know I'll be traveling next week in case you need to reach me. Traveling? Where? Washington? A pause. Washington State? D.C. Longer pause. What's in Washington, Dad? I looked at the presidential letter on my table, at the photograph of me with a man who'd grown from the 8-year-old I'd saved into the leader of the free world. An old friend wants to catch up, I said. That's great, Dad. That's really great. You should get out more. The condescension in his voice was so familiar, I barely noticed it anymore. Like background music in an elevator, annoying if you paid attention, ignorable if you didn't. I should let you go, he said. Liz is calling me. Of course she is. After he hung up, I walked to my bedroom and opened my closet. In the back, wrapped in plastic, hung my dress uniform from 40 years of service. I'd worn it exactly 3 times since my retirement, my wife's funeral, David's wedding, and Emma's baptism. Now I had a 4th occasion. I spent the afternoon at the dry cleaners, then at the barber's for the first time in 2 months. The young man cutting my hair made small talk about the weather, the holidays, his girlfriend's family drama. Normal conversation, the kind I hadn't had in my own house for years. Special occasion, he asked, noticing how carefully I was examining his work in the mirror. You could say that. That evening, I sat down to write something I'd never written before. A letter to my grandchildren, not the kind of letter you send, the kind you leave behind. Dear Mason and Emma, I began, there are things about your grandfather you've never known. I told them about the school in Philadelphia, about the smoke and the screaming and the impossibility of the choice I'd had to make, save who I could reach or risk losing everyone trying to save them all. I told them about the boy I'd carried out first, how light he'd felt in my arms, how he'd whispered, "Thank you," through tears and soot. I told them about the other 11 children and the teacher who'd held them together while I made 3 trips through flames that should have killed me. I told them about the medal they'd given me and the newspaper articles and how their father used to brag about having a hero for a dad. I told them about the man that boy became and how he'd never forgotten, even when everyone else had. Heroes aren't people who don't feel afraid, I wrote. Heroes are people who feel afraid and do what needs doing anyway. Remember that when life asks you to choose between what's easy and what's right. I sealed the letter in an envelope with their names on it and placed it in my desk drawer. Then I called the airline to confirm my flight. Monday morning, Washington, D.C., the White House. 55 years after I'd saved his life, I was going to see that boy again. But first, I had a family dinner to attend on Sunday. Liz had called that afternoon, the first time she'd called me directly in over a year. "Frank, I hope you don't mind, but I invited you to dinner this weekend, just family, nothing fancy." "Of course," I said. "I'll be there." "Wonderful. Oh, and Frank, could you bring those stories you used to tell the kids about your Army days? Mason's doing a school project on family history." For the first time in a very long time, my daughter-in-law wanted to hear about my past. She had no idea how much past she was about to get. Friday evening, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my dress uniform. The fabric still fit, though it felt different now. Heavier, somehow. The weight of memory. The medals caught the lamplight. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Distinguished Service Cross, ribbons that told stories my family had never asked to hear. Stories that would have explained why their grandfather wasn't just some old man cluttering up their perfect photographs. Saturday morning, Mason called me directly. Not his father, not his mother. Me. "Grandpa Frank, Mom said you might have some Army stories for my project." "I might," I said, looking at the plane ticket on my kitchen counter. "What kind of project?" "Family heroes. I have to write about someone in my family who did something brave." The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of being cropped out of their pictures, I was finally worth including in something. A school assignment about bravery. "I'll bring some things to dinner tomorrow," I told him. "Stories you've never heard." "Really? Dad always said you didn't like talking about the war." "Your dad never asked." That afternoon, I drove to the library and made photocopies of the newspaper articles from 1968. The headlines looked surreal in modern light. "Sergeant saves 12 in hostage crisis." "Local hero prevents massacre at elementary school." "Quick thinking soldier ends siege." There was a quote from the principal. "Sergeant Miller went back into that building 3 times. We told him it was too dangerous, that he'd done enough. He said, 'Not while there are children inside.'" And another from the fire chief. "I've been doing this job for 25 years. I've never seen courage like that." At the bottom of the last article, a small paragraph I'd forgotten about. Among the rescued children was 8-year-old Timothy Morrison, whose father serves on the city council. "I want to be just like Sergeant Miller when I grow up," the boy told reporters. Timothy Morrison. The name felt familiar, but I couldn't place it until I got home and looked at the presidential letter again. The signature wasn't the current president's name. It was Timothy Morrison's. Tim Morrison had become President Morrison. The boy I'd carried out of that burning school now lived in the White House. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, pieces of a 55-year puzzle finally clicking together. No wonder he'd responded to my letter. No wonder he'd cleared his entire afternoon schedule. The phone rang. "David." "Dad, about tomorrow's dinner. Liz wanted me to ask if you could come a little early. Help set up chairs and things." "Of course. The same request as always." "Frank, can you help with the coats?" "Frank, can you get the extra chairs from the garage?" "Frank, can you stay out of the way while we take pictures?" "Great. And Dad, thanks for helping with Mason's project. Liz is excited to hear your stories too." After 20 years of marriage to David, after countless family gatherings where she'd barely acknowledged my presence, Liz was suddenly excited to hear my stories. "I'll bring plenty," I said. Sunday morning, I woke early and made a decision that surprised even me. I put on my dress uniform, not for dinner. That would be too much, too obvious. But I wanted to see myself in it one more time before I faced my family. The man looking back at me in the mirror wasn't the invisible grandfather they'd trained me to become. He was Sergeant Frank Miller, Bronze Star recipient, the soldier who'd saved 12 lives on a Tuesday morning in Philadelphia when courage mattered more than comfort. I changed into civilian clothes, but left the medals on my dresser where I could see them. Reminders of who I'd been before I became furniture in their lives. At 3 o'clock, I gathered the newspaper clippings, drove to David's house, and knocked on the door like a stranger carrying stories that would change everything. Liz answered, wearing her perfect hostess smile. "Frank, you're early. Perfect. Could you help David with the extra table in the garage?" "Of course," I said, stepping inside. "But first, I brought something for Mason." I handed him the folder of newspaper clippings. His eyes widened as he read the headlines. "Grandpa, this is you." "It's me." Emma peered over his shoulder, reading aloud. "Sergeant Miller risked his life repeatedly to save children trapped in a burning school." Her voice trailed off as she looked at me with new eyes. "You never told us," David said, reading over their shoulders. "You never asked," I replied. "But Mason asked for his school project." Liz was reading now, too, her perfect composure cracking slightly. "Frank, I had no idea. You saved 12 children." 13, actually," I said, watching their faces. "The newspaper got the count wrong." What I didn't tell them was that one of those children was now expecting me at the White House in exactly 24 hours. Some surprises are worth saving for dessert. Sunday night, the Miller house smelled of rosemary chicken and fresh bread, the kind of comforting aroma that should have meant home, but only reminded me how far I'd drifted from belonging here. In the kitchen, Liz's voice rose and fell above the steady clink of dishes being gathered, David's responses coming in short, contented murmurs. The dining table was set with her usual precision. Silverware aligned like soldiers on parade, wine glasses positioned to catch every flicker of light from the chandelier overhead, white candles waiting unlit in their silver holders. I sat apart in the living room with Mason and Emma, the manila folder spread open between us like a bridge to a past they'd never known existed. Newspaper clippings lay scattered across the mahogany coffee table, yellowed fragments of headlines that had once screamed my name across front pages. Mason traced one headline with his index finger, lips moving silently as he absorbed words like hero and courage attached to his grandfather. Every few moments he would glance up at my face as if trying to reconcile the quiet man sitting before him with the soldier described in bold print. Emma held a different clipping, her 12-year-old eyes wide as she read aloud in a whisper. Sergeant Miller made 3 separate trips into the burning building, refusing to abandon children still trapped inside. She looked at me with something approaching awe. "Grandpa, you really did this?" "I did what needed doing," I said simply. David appeared in the doorway, kitchen towels still in his hands, preparing to call us to dinner. He stopped mid-step when he saw the spread across the table, his eyes scanning the headlines with growing recognition. "Mason," he said slowly, "where did you find all this?" "I didn't find it," Mason replied without looking up from the article in his hands. "Grandpa gave it to me for my school project about family heroes." David's gaze shifted to me, confusion mixing with something harder to define. "You've had these all this time?" 43 years, I confirmed. "You never thought to show me? Show us?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I met his stare without flinching, without accusation. "You never asked." Emma looked up from another clipping, her voice soft but clear. "Dad, it says here Grandpa got a medal from the president, a Bronze Star." David's smile was tight, automatic. "That was a long time ago, sweetheart." 55 years, I corrected quietly. "Some things don't fade with time." Liz appeared behind David, drawn by the unusual quiet in our conversation. Her perpetual hostess smile was in place, but I could see tension gathering around the edges of her carefully composed expression. She peered over David's shoulder at the newspaper clippings, her eyes widening as she read. "Frank," she said, her voice carrying a note I hadn't heard before, "these articles are incredible. Why didn't you ever tell us about any of this?" I could have reminded her of the evening 3 years ago when I'd started to share a story from my service days, and she'd smoothly steered the conversation toward Emma's piano recital and the weather forecast. I could have told her about the subtle but persistent way my past had been edited out of family conversations, the way war stories were politely deflected in favor of safer topics. Instead, I kept my answer simple. It never seemed like the right time. Dinner proceeded differently than our usual Sunday gatherings. The conversation came in careful bursts, punctuated by longer silences as everyone processed what they'd seen. Mason filled most of the gaps with questions that tumbled out faster than I could answer them. What was it like inside the burning school? Did you know any of the children personally? Were you scared? I answered him the way I'd learned to answer during 40 years of military service, directly, without embellishment, sticking to facts that mattered. I told him about the heat that hit you like a physical wall, about smoke so thick you had to navigate by touch and memory. I described the sound of children crying behind locked classroom doors, the chaos of teachers trying to maintain order when order had become impossible. I was scared, I admitted, watching his young face absorb every word. Fear was there, metallic on my tongue, but there wasn't time to dwell on it. Too many people needed help. Liz and David listened mostly in silence, exchanging glances across the table that I pretended not to notice. I could see them recalibrating, trying to fit this new information into their understanding of who I was supposed to be in their lives. After dessert had been served and cleared, after Emma had asked to be excused to finish homework, I stepped outside into the November cold. From my car trunk, I retrieved a garment bag I'd brought but hadn't yet shown them. I carried it back inside and laid it carefully across the living room couch. The zipper opened with a soft whisper, revealing what I'd kept preserved for decades, my dress uniform, pressed and ready, and beside it, a small velvet case containing the medals I'd earned but never displayed. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Distinguished Service Cross, silent witnesses to days that had shaped me long before any of them were born. The room fell into a profound silence, the kind that shifts the very air around you. Emma returned from upstairs, drawn by some instinct that something important was happening. She approached the couch slowly, her hand hovering over the velvet case without quite touching it, as if the medals were sacred relics she didn't dare disturb. "These are beautiful, Grandpa," she whispered. Mason joined her, reading the inscriptions on each medal with the reverence of someone discovering buried treasure. "For valor in combat," he read aloud, "for wounds received in action against an enemy of the United States." I watched my family see me differently for the first time in decades, not as the aging man who helped carry groceries and stayed out of photo frames, but as someone who had mattered, who had made choices that saved lives. "I'm leaving tomorrow morning," I said into the quiet. David's head snapped up. "Where to?" "Washington, D.C. I have a meeting with the president." He frowned, processing this information slowly. The president? What kind of meeting? Tim Morrison invited me, I said, watching the exact moment recognition struck his features. I carried him out of that building in Philadelphia. The words settled between us like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. Dad, are you telling me that you personally know the President of the United States? I'm telling you I saved his life when he was 8 years old. Liz's wine glass trembled slightly in her hand. That's unbelievable. No, I said quietly, meeting her eyes. It's just been forgotten. The remainder of the evening moved like a slow tide pulling back from shore. Conversations happened in smaller groups, voices lower than usual. When it came time to leave, Mason hugged me with an intensity that surprised us both. Emma lingered at the door, studying my face as if memorizing it. "Will you tell us more stories when you get back?" she asked. "If you'd like to hear them," I replied. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, frost tracing delicate patterns across my bedroom window. I packed with military precision. 1 civilian suit, 1 dress tie, my uniform folded with the care I'd learned 60 years ago, and the letter from the president's office tucked securely in my jacket pocket. At the airport, I moved through security and boarding with the quiet efficiency of someone who had traveled under more difficult circumstances. The flight gave me 3 uninterrupted hours to remember everything I'd tried to forget. Tim Morrison's soot-covered face, the way his small hands had gripped my sleeve like it was the only solid thing left in his collapsing world. The teacher who'd held other children while I made my second trip back into the flames. I also remembered the boy I couldn't reach before the roof gave way. They never wrote about him in the newspapers. Some losses you carry alone. Washington greeted me with bitter cold and a black sedan waiting at the curb, the driver already holding a sign with my name and rank. He treated me with a deference I hadn't experienced in years, calling me Sergeant and Sir with genuine respect. The hotel was elegant, my room on the 8th floor with a clear view of Pennsylvania Avenue. The White House sat beyond the trees, close enough that I could see the lights in its windows. I spent the evening looking out at it, preparing myself for a conversation that had been 55 years in the making. Tuesday afternoon, a Navy lieutenant in dress blues escorted me through security gates that parted like curtains. Cameras flashed from the gathered press corps, though I doubted anyone knew why I was there. Inside, the hallways gleamed with polished marble and the weight of history, staff members moving with the purposeful quiet of people who understood the gravity of their workplace. And then I saw him, Tim Morrison, President of the United States, walking toward me across the Oval Office. He was older now, hair silver at the temples, lines around his eyes that spoke of hard decisions and sleepless nights. But I recognized him instantly, the same boy I'd carried to safety all those years ago. He crossed the room without hesitation, his hand extended. Frank Miller. "Mr. President," I replied, accepting his firm handshake. "No," he said firmly, his grip tightening. "Tim, after what you did for me, it's Tim." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he pulled me into an embrace that was brief but real, the kind of contact that acknowledges a debt that can never be fully repaid. "You saved my life," he said when he stepped back. "Every day I've lived since then every accomplishment, every moment of joy, all of it exists because of your courage on that Tuesday morning in Philadelphia. I'd do it again, I told him, the simplicity of the statement carrying the weight of absolute truth. We talked for over an hour in the most powerful office in the world. No cameras or staff present, just two men connected by a moment that had changed both our lives. He remembered details I'd lost to time. The smell of chalk dust mixing with smoke, the sound of sirens growing closer, the exact words the teacher had spoken when I'd led her class to safety. Before I left, an aide appeared with a photographer. Tim insisted on several pictures, both of us standing before the resolute desk, then shaking hands again by the window. Before I walked out of his office, he handed me a framed photo from our meeting, his own inscription written in careful script below our image. To Sergeant Frank Miller, my hero, then and now. With eternal gratitude, Tim Morrison. The flight home felt different, lighter somehow. I carried the frame in my lap, studying the faces in the photograph, mine weathered by age and experience, his bearing the confidence of someone who had risen to the highest office in the land. Two lives intersected by crisis, connected by choice. When I arrived home Wednesday evening, I placed the frame on my mantel, adjusting its position until it caught the light from the table lamp beside it. I didn't call David. I didn't call Liz or the children. They would see it soon enough. And when they did, something fundamental in our family's understanding would shift forever. Because once you've been truly seen for who you are, you can never be erased again. Friday afternoon, Liz called me for the second time in 6 months, her voice carrying that particular brightness she reserved for family obligations she'd rather avoid, but couldn't quite escape. Frank, I hope you're free Sunday evening. We're having a little dinner party, nothing fancy, just family and a few close friends. David thought it would be nice to have you there. Of course, I said, though we both knew David hadn't thought of anything. This was Liz orchestrating another perfect gathering where I'd serve as background scenery, helping with coats and staying clear of conversations that mattered. Wonderful. Could you come a bit early? Maybe help David set up the extra table from the garage. The same request as always. Frank, could you help with the chairs? Frank, would you mind staying in the kitchen while we take photos? Frank, could you make yourself useful somewhere else? I'll be there, I said. Saturday evening, I pressed my best shirt and selected a tie I hadn't worn in months. Not because the dinner party required it, but because I wanted to look like a man who deserved to be in the room. I wrapped the framed photograph from the president in tissue paper and placed it in a small gift bag, not to show off, but because some truths needed to emerge naturally, in their own time. Sunday arrived gray and bitter, winter settling deep into the bones of the city. I drove to David's house, through streets lined with early Christmas decorations, past families visible through warm windows, everyone preparing for holidays that would come whether they were ready or not. The house buzzed with preparation when I arrived. Liz moved through rooms with military precision, adjusting flowers, repositioning candles, ensuring every detail matched her vision of sophisticated entertaining. David wrestled with the additional table in the dining room, muttering under his breath about uneven legs and stubborn screws. "Dad, perfect timing," he said when he saw me. "Could you help me get this stable?" I set down my coat in the gift bag, rolled up my sleeves, and worked with him until the table sat level and solid. We covered it with one of Liz's good tablecloths, added chairs from various rooms, created space for 12 people where 8 usually sat. "Expecting a crowd tonight?" I asked. "Liz invited the Hendersons, the Moores, and her sister's family," David replied, checking his watch. "Should be a full house." Mason appeared from upstairs, wearing a button-down shirt and the expression of someone resigned to an evening of adult conversation he'd rather avoid. Emma followed, her hair in careful curls, already practicing the polite smile she'd need for greeting guests. "Hey, Grandpa Frank," Mason said, genuine warmth breaking through his teenage reserve. "Mom said you went to Washington. How was it?" "Interesting," I replied. "I'll tell you about it later." The first guests arrived at 6. The Hendersons, a couple in their 50s who lived 3 blocks away and shared Liz's enthusiasm for neighborhood politics and property values. Then came the Moores, followed by Liz's sister Janet with her husband and twin boys. Soon, the house filled with the sound of conversation, laughter, and the careful choreography of people who knew each other well enough to be comfortable, but not so well that they could speak without thinking. I moved through the evening as I always did, helping with drinks, collecting empty plates, staying useful but unobtrusive. The conversations flowed around me like water around a stone. Work promotions, vacation plans, the rising cost of private school tuition, complaints about city council decisions that would affect property taxes. During the main course, Liz's famous beef tenderloin with the roasted vegetables, the talk turned to family histories. Janet was telling a story about finding old photographs in their mother's attic. How surprising it had been to discover relatives she'd never known existed. "Family secrets always surface eventually," she said, laughing. "You think you know everything about your own people, and then you find out your great-uncle was apparently some kind of war hero nobody ever talked about." "That's so true," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "My father never mentioned his service until right before he died. Turned out he'd been at D-Day. Can you imagine keeping something like that quiet for 60 years? David glanced at me across the table, something unreadable in his expression. "Some people just don't like talking about the past," he said. "I think it's generational," Mr. Moore added. "Men from that era, they didn't process trauma the way we do now. They just buried it and moved on." The conversation continued around themes of family mysteries and generational silence, everyone sharing stories of relatives who'd kept significant portions of their lives hidden from their children and grandchildren. I listened, ate my dinner, and waited. After the main course, while Liz orchestrated the serving of dessert and coffee, I excused myself to retrieve something from my coat. The gift bag sat where I'd left it by the front door, tissue paper still crisp and untouched. When I returned to the dining room, the conversation had shifted to Christmas plans and New Year's resolutions. I set the bag beside my place setting and waited for a natural pause in the discussion. "Before we finish the evening," I said quietly, "I brought something to share." The table gradually quieted, all attention turning toward me with the polite interest people show when the elderly relative announces he has something to say. I could see Liz's slight tension. This wasn't part of her carefully orchestrated script for the evening. I removed the tissue paper and lifted out the framed photograph, setting it in the center of the table where everyone could see it clearly. The image showed 2 men shaking hands in what was unmistakably the Oval Office, myself and President Morrison. both smiling, the presidential seal visible in the background. The silence that followed was profound, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. Janet leaned forward first, reading the inscription aloud in a voice that grew steadier with each word. To Sergeant Frank Miller, my hero, then and now. With eternal gratitude, Tim Morrison. Mrs. Henderson's fork clattered against her plate. Frank, is this real? It is, I said simply. Mason's eyes were wide. Grandpa, you met the president? I've known him for 55 years, I replied, since he was 8 years old. David's voice was careful, controlled. Dad, what exactly are you telling us? I looked around the table at faces ranging from confusion to amazement to something approaching awe. Then I told them the story I'd kept quiet for more than half a century, about the school in Philadelphia, about the fire and the gunman, about the 12 children I'd carried to safety while the building burned around us, about the boy who'd gripped my sleeve and whispered, "Thank you," through tears and smoke. I told them about Tim Morrison growing up to become a governor, then a senator, then president of the United States, about the letter I'd written and mailed last month, and about the invitation that had followed, about sitting in the Oval Office with the most powerful man in the world, who still remembered being 8 years old and afraid and grateful to be alive. When I finished, the silence stretched long enough for Emma to count to 20 in her head. I could see her lips moving slightly as she did it. Finally, Liz spoke, her voice softer than I'd heard it in years. Frank, we had no idea. You've never said anything about any of this. You've never asked, I said gently, without accusation. And until recently, it seemed like ancient history. But it's not ancient history, Janet said, studying the photograph. This was taken when? Last week? Tuesday afternoon. Mr. Henderson shook his head slowly. Frank, do you realize what this means? You saved the president's life. You're part of American history. I did my job, I said. Nothing more, nothing less. But Mason wasn't satisfied with modesty. Grandpa, this is incredible. Do you have other stories like this? Other things you've never told us? I looked at my grandson, at the genuine curiosity and admiration in his young face, and realized that for the first time in years, someone in my family was truly interested in hearing about my life. A few, I admitted, if you'd like to hear them. The evening transformed after that. Guests who'd barely acknowledged my presence suddenly wanted to know everything about my military service, about the other medals I'd mentioned, about experiences I'd kept locked away for decades. The conversation that had once flowed around me now centered on me, and I found myself sharing stories I hadn't told since my wife was alive. As the guests prepared to leave, each one shook my hand with a respect that felt entirely new. Mrs. Henderson hugged me goodbye, whispering that she was honored to know me. Mr. Moore asked if I'd consider speaking to his son's Boy Scout troop about service and heroism. After the last guest departed and the dishes were cleared, David found me in the living room, staring at the photograph still sitting on the coffee table where Mason had placed it for safekeeping. "Dad," he said, settling into the chair beside me, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For not seeing you, for not asking, for treating you like—" He struggled for the right words. "Like furniture in our lives instead of the man who raised me." I studied my son's face, seeing genuine remorse there alongside something that might have been pride. "You're a good man, David. You've got a good family. Sometimes we just need reminding about what matters." "Will you teach me?" he asked. "About your service? About the stories I should have been asking to hear all along?" "If you want to learn them." Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her party dress but barefoot now, hair escaping from its careful curls. "Grandpa Frank, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." "Are you proud of what you did? Saving all those people?" I considered the question carefully, thinking about the weight of memory and the strange paths that lead us to moments of choice. I'm proud that when the moment came, I didn't hesitate. That's all any of us can hope for, that when it matters, we'll do the right thing. She nodded solemnly, processing this with the seriousness children bring to concepts they're just beginning to understand. Later that evening, as I prepared to drive home, Liz approached me in the hallway. She held herself differently now, less perfectly composed, more genuinely present. "Frank, I want you to know that things are going to be different now. At family gatherings, in our photos, in everything. You're not going to be invisible anymore." "I appreciate that, Liz. And I want to apologize for making you feel like you didn't belong in our family pictures. You're the most important person in our family photos. You're the reason David exists, the reason Mason and Emma exist. We should have been honoring you, not hiding you." I nodded, accepting her words without making her discomfort worse with unnecessary responses. As I drove home through streets now decorated for Christmas, I thought about the strange circularity of life, how a moment of crisis in 1968 had led to an invitation in 2023, which had led to an evening when my family finally saw me as more than the sum of my limitations and losses. At home, I placed the presidential photograph on my mantel next to pictures of my late wife, my children, my grandchildren. For the first time in years, I looked forward to the next family gathering, to conversations that would include my voice, to photographs that would include my face. Some things, once lost, can be recovered. Some silences, once broken, lead to better conversations. And some heroes, once forgotten, can be remembered again. Not because they demand recognition, but because the people who loved them finally learned to see what was always there. The following Sunday, when Liz called to invite me to their next family gathering, her voice carried something I hadn't heard in 20 years. Genuine warmth. "Frank, we're doing a big family photo session for our Christmas cards. Professional photographer, the works. And this time, you're going right in the center. David insists on it." As I hung up the phone, I walked to my mantel, where the presidential photograph sat beside pictures of my grandchildren, my late wife, my son, at various ages. The afternoon light caught the glass just right, and for a moment I could see my reflection superimposed over President Morrison's inscription, "My hero, then and now." It occurred to me that heroes aren't people who save others once and retire into quiet obscurity. Heroes are people who keep showing up, keep caring, keep hoping that love will eventually triumph over neglect. Next Sunday, I would take my place in that family photograph not as someone being grudgingly included, but as someone whose presence made the picture complete, and perhaps 55 years from now, one of my great-grandchildren would discover that photograph in an old album and wonder about the man standing proudly in the center, the grandfather who once saved a future president, who once mattered enough to be remembered by the most powerful person in the world, but who mattered most because he never stopped believing his family was worth loving, even when they forgot he was worth seeing.